Homo Criminalis, a historical overview of mass incarceration. I put a message in the chat box about our having to stop right at 12:50 today. Typically, we let our community conversations kind of go on until everybody's done, or more like 1 or a little past 1. But we have another program immediately after this, and so we'll have to have a hard stop. I don't want to be impolite or rude, so just want to give you a heads up on that. Alexa also put information about our sign language interpreter in the chat, so if you want to read that. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Glenn, and then we'll hand the microphone over to him. So Dr. Jason Glenn joined KUMC's Department of History and Philosophy of Medicine in 2018. Prior to joining KUMC, he was the James Wade Rockwell Distinguished Professor in Medical History at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, and a senior fellow at the Center to Eliminate Health Disparities, also at UTMB. He received his BA from Stanford University in 1996 and received both his MA and his PhD in the history of science and medicine from Harvard University in 2001 and 2005, respectively. His areas of specialty include health inequities, the history of drug policy in the US, ethics, and in the history of human subject research, and demonstrating biological notions of race and discourses of genetic determination. Dr. Glenn is also the former director and founder of Sobriety High Incorporated, a nonprofit organization providing community reentry services for persons with a history of substance abuse who are returning home from incarceration. So with pleasure, we hand it over to Dr. Glenn. Thank you, Dr. Glenn, and welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for joining me again here with Community Conversations. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and I'm going to rush right in because we have that hard stop at 12:50, and I have a lot of information I want to try to get to. So first, I'm going to start us with a quote from Charles Ferre. In his book, Criminality and Degeneration, where he says, "It is impossible to accept social solidarity without reservation in a society where a certain number of members are unproductive and destructive, incapable of rendering anything, above all when these individuals run the greatest risk of procreating offspring even more degenerate than themselves. Society is an organism. Like all organisms, it is threatened by death each time one of its organs ceases to function." And I chose that quote because it so clearly illustrates a change in concept about how we think about people and how we think about society and how we think about deviance that arose during the 19th century that has really laid the blueprint for both policing and mass incarceration as we know it to this day. So how did we get to this point? My objectives for you this afternoon, I want to give a historical overview of how prisons became thinkable as a progressive way to organize a society. Explore how the idea of criminal, or how the idea of a criminal became naturalized and biologized. Also want to understand how historical incarceration movements have been responses to destabilizations in the racial caste system of America, and then finally contextualize contemporary criminal justice policies within this history. So, what made prisons thinkable? To orient us, it's important to realize that incarceration as a form of criminal punishment is a comparatively recent episode in Anglo-American jurisprudence. Before the late 1700s, we didn't really have what we know as contemporary prisons where people were put away for long periods of time. Before the 19th century, sentences of penal confinement were rare in the criminal courts of Europe and North America. There were city and county jails, but most punishments were corporal in nature. So you were held in a jail until it was decided upon your corporal form of punishment. One only stayed in jail long enough until a punishment was decided. There were madhouses used to warehouse the insane, the destitute who were sick, because if you had means, you didn't go to a hospital or someplace else to be treated, you were treated at home. Also, enemies of the monarch were all thrown in these basic warehouses that predated both the prison, the hospital, and the asylum. So the modern prison is actually an idea of the Enlightenment emerging in the late 18th and early 19th century. I point us to this very famous sketching by Giambattista Piranesi from the 1750s. And we see here sort of a classic depiction of the kinds of dungeons that warehoused indiscriminately the mad and people who were destitute and people who were just largely put away. We see here at the bottom, there's scaffolding for various forms of torture. There's someone being dragged here down these steps in the middle. You see the large chains against the wall. There's someone being beaten up here, right in the direct center of the photograph. This was inspired by the Bastilles that were often used and transformed into these madhouses and warehouses for such persons deemed unfortunate enough to be sent here. The original Bastille, of course, in Paris, but many other cities followed suit, like Paris did to construct Bastilles, constructed in the 14th and 15th centuries to defend cities, but later converted into these dungeons to house the mad, the criminals, the destitute, sick, and enemies of the monarch. Here, a separate sketching from Jean-Honoré Fragonard, the council chamber of the Bastille. You can see the same kinds of arches, very high ceilings, and that inspired the previous sketchings. But this is what punishment looked like before our modern prison system, for the most part. People were either beat, they were put in pillories or the stocks, or they were hanged. And your punishment was public. And it was the idea to try to get away from such types of barbaric public punishments that birthed the idea for the prison. Here in America, this started with the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. And their first meeting was in 1787, where a few men gathered at the home of Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia to discuss reforming the Walnut Street Jail. The jail was located directly behind Independence Hall, and the conditions there were said to be barbaric. Rape, robbery, and beatings were common, and it wasn't unusual for prisoners to die of either hypothermia or starvation. Dr. Benjamin Rush, another co-signer of the Constitution, called for a house of repentance. And this is where the term penitentiary comes from. Rush proclaimed that crime was a moral disease and argued that a place where prisoners could meditate in solitude and experience spiritual remorse through hard labor would lead to their rehabilitation. They advocated for the creation of large penitentiaries in order to ensure that prisoners were being properly handled. So like I said, this is a very progressive idea. At the time, it was thought of as this is a new moral way to treat folks. This is a sketching of the Walnut Street Jail that was newly constructed and opened in 1790. The idea for humane treatment, honest work, religious meditation, and most importantly for our talk, the scientific study of both the criminal and the criminal type. After a deadly riot in 1820, the Prison Society members escalated calls for a larger state institution purpose-built for the separation of all prisoners. And we'll get to that larger state institution in a minute. Here is the back gate of Independence Hall as it stood at the time, just to orient some of us. This is an old map of Philadelphia from the 1790s. I'm going to locate here. It's this little quadrant right here where both, if we zoom it out, we can see up here is where Independence Hall lies. This was that back gate we were just seeing right here. And right here is where the Walnut Street Jail lied at that time. It wasn't just a progressive movement in the United States, also simultaneously taking place in European circles. So I point us to one of the most famous madhouses and then hospitals in Europe, which is La Salpêtrière. It was originally a gunpowder factory, which is where the name comes from. Salpêtrière is French for saltpeter. It was converted in 1680 to a, quote, hospice, which was a dumping ground for the poor, insane, criminals, alcoholics, and the sick, especially women. And most famously, in 1795, Philippe Pinel became chief physician and soon after begins what is called moral treatment. This is a famous painting by Tony Fleury of Pinel famously taking the mad out of the chains and beginning his version of moral treatment. So it's Pinel freeing the mad from the chains. The conceptual reforms initiated by Pinel eventually led to its conversion into a true psychiatric hospital. And later, for any of those who know any history psychiatry, Jean Martin Charcot arrives in 1862, where he sets up a neurology clinic and conducts his famous studies on hysteria. That's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. It's important for me to point out here that this new conception of moral treatment was an outgrowth of a new conception of what it meant to be human that was also emerging here in the late 18th, early 19th century. The idea of what it meant to be human had gone through a few changes since the 15th century. In the 15th century, humans were thought of as spiritual beings. And then beginning in the 16th and 18th through 18th centuries, what it meant to be human was reconceptualized in terms of rationality. So we talked about what it meant to be human in terms of their degrees of rationality as separate from different animal species. And it wasn't until the 19th century that we began to think about what it meant to be human in biological terms. This led to the new sciences of man, including biology, including history, including sociology, including psychology. And it also led to a new mode of perception, what Michel Foucault called the clinical gaze in the biomedical world, in terms of how to look at persons and imagine the biological workings going on inside, and specifically biological pathology when it comes to medicine. And so that was how we came to develop a new conception of medical intervention. Of course, for the purposes of this talk, it also led to the disaggregation of the hospital, the asylum, and the prison out of those madhouses as folks began to conceive of each of them differently and as ways to possibly treat them and cure them. Prisons in the US. Their prison building efforts in the US go through three major waves. There's the early 19th century, where moral treatment movement led to new prisons built on the model of using rehabilitative labor as the primary penalty. Then the late 19th century, after the Civil War, bringing a number of new prisons in the American South and transforming the penitentiary system into the convict lease system. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the post-civil rights movement. In the 1970s, it saw the beginnings of an unprecedented expansion of prison systems at both the federal and state levels. Leading off the new prison construction was Newgate Prison in New York. This was a copy of Newgate in London, but it officially opened in 1796 and opened with the idea of these same principles of humane treatment, honest work, religious meditation, and the scientific study of the criminal type. And we can see following that lead here a list of where more and more prisons began opening in the US. New Jersey in 1798, Virginia and Kentucky in 1800, Massachusetts 1805, Vermont in 1807. And I think Vermont had the longest running one, Windsor Penitentiary, around for almost 170 years. Maryland, 1811, you can see on down there. Lastly, with California and San Quentin in 1852. But this was a movement that spread throughout the country and slowly moved west and slowly moved south as well. I particularly want to point out Eastern State Penitentiary, which became the official state prison of Pennsylvania from 1829 to 1971. Walnut Street Jail became soon very overcrowded because it just wasn't big enough. And that's when they decided to build Eastern State Penitentiary. This is also still under the governing board of the Society to Eliminate the Miseries of Prisons, headed by Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush. And this model right here that you see, this sort of spoke system, really created the model that would be followed from them on out. And I want to point out a few things. Here, not only the long corridors that stretch from a central observation location, but also between the long corridors and dormitories, all the different plots of land set about for various farming activities. The goal was to move away from public corporal forms of punishment to this humane system that combats antisocial behaviors by promoting self-reflection. Here is an internal view of Eastern State, which is one of the few from this era that are still standing. And is now a museum outside Philly. Designed by architect John Haviland, it emphasized solitary incarceration as a means for facilitating the prisoner's penitence. The monastic interior and its vaulted hallways and skylights were said to allow inmates to better commune with God. And you see the cells on the side here. As we said, they were all solitary cells, and we know now, many years later, that solitary confinement does not become a means for facilitating deep meditation. It becomes a means for driving someone further, deeper into mental illnesses. So, positivism and the discourses of progress in the new sciences of man. What do I mean by that? I have a couple guiding quotes, one from Auguste Comte. As much as the physical world operates according to gravity and other absolute laws, so does society. And finally, from Pierre Larousse in his grand dictionary, humanity is perfectible and it moves incessantly from less good to better, from ignorance to science, from barbarism to civilization. The idea that humanity becomes day by day better and happier is particularly dear to our century. Faith in the new law of progress is the true faith of our century. And so here you see just this idea that we are going to be uncovering the secrets that govern how we tick as human beings. I'm going to turn us now to Benedict Augustin Morel, who was from England but went to study at La Salpêtrière in 1842. Like Pinel, he was also an advocate for non-restraint and removing chains from patients. He was increasingly preoccupied with the demarcation of patients who were treatable versus those who were incurable. And his writings helped transform the moral treatment phase of incarceration. Here, from his treatise on degeneration, he wrote that ignorance of the distinctive character of these morbid varieties introduces a deplorable confusion in treatment. Where moral therapeutics should exert its influence, reigns the repressive force of law. And from another angle, hopes which must be cruelly deceived in practice direct all the activity of medicine towards the cure of unmodifiable beings. So here we see was beginning to creep into the discourse around incarceration of this time, that all that solitary confinement wasn't actually helping people to improve. Shortly thereafter, we get the collapse of the moral treatment model, where prison authorities erroneously blamed further mental instability of inmates on masturbation and also on race. For African Americans, they maintain were particularly susceptible. Solitary confinement ended up being a feared form of punishment, creating more antisocial behavior than it solved. Combined with overcrowding and economic infeasibility, the Pennsylvania system's inefficacy led to the model's gradual collapse in the second half of the 19th century. Eastern State formally dropped the model in 1913, switching to a congregate system that permitted greater social interaction. This transition amounted to a tacit acknowledgement by administrators and their political overseers that the Philadelphia Society's grand experiment had failed. And this led to a kind of crisis of faith. In the face of the failures of the new sciences to live up to the positivist promise of the era and cure or prevent crime, insanity, etc., scholars turned to the discourse of heredity. Here I quote Prosper Lucas in his treatise on natural heredity. From whatever point of view one approaches it, heredity presents immense problems. In the social sphere, it evokes first the question of property. In the political sphere, the principle and succession of sovereignty. In the civil sphere, the principle and succession of ownership in art, literature, science, and industry. In the natural order, heredity is a law, a force, and a fact, one of the great marvels of existence. Benedict Morel also, wrote extensively, picked up on the idea of heredity. And when he talked about madness, he argued that it cannot always be seen or heard, that it lurks hidden in the body, incubated by parents and passed on to their children, involved a progressively intensifying tyranny of the body over the spirit or soul. And he wrote that the typical character of the head in the degenerate beings will not be the sole element of our classification. The distinctions do not rest only upon external differences, but upon internal differences also. In his treatise on degeneration, he focused on patterns of heredity, especially deviations from the normal, quote unquote, type of humanity. He conflated physical conditions with moral and social habits, making the argument that both were inherited. So this was very common during this time period to conflate the inheritability of things like eye color, or hair color and hair texture with social behaviors. Of particular concern was a fear of the urban dangerous classes. And this melds well with the history of policing as it arose during the same time. There was a fear of the dangerous classes that were hidden among us. Here I quote H.A. Freire. Besides this civilized society, there are other classes which possess neither intelligence, responsibility, nor moral sentiment, whose spirit finds no enlightenment nor consolidation in religion. Some of these varieties have been rightly designated as the dangerous classes. We do not accuse, we describe the action of degenerative causes, and we seek to understand how the morbid varieties of the species are formed. There is a specter haunting the ruling classes. Indeed, the fallen races and unhealthy varieties not only offer a special kind of degenerate, but existing in their habits, their manners, and their instincts are pathologies that cannot be explained by the influence of environmental degenerative causes. Therefore, we seek to scientifically elucidate these most difficult and most complex cases as they signal a permanent danger to European societies. We must moralize the masses. Morel's influence reached wide. Here I quote Philippe Boucher, where he says, "Gentlemen, the question of the degenerescence of the human species has been born. Our task now, I maintain, is to find out how it can happen that within a population such as ours, races may form, not merely one, but several races, so miserable, inferior, and bastardized, they may be classed as below the most inferior savage races, for their inferiority is sometimes beyond cure. Dr. Morel points out that it is from the midst of degenerates that most of the bandits, incendiaries, hardcore criminals come, and on a higher level, even from well-to-do classes, incorrigible debauchers, false spirits, and people of evil instincts who are a scourge and a danger to society." We even see these theories pop up in the writings of Emile Durkheim with the early conceptions of sociology. Durkheim utilized theories of heredity, pathology, and nervousness to help explain social phenomena, particularly the forces and limits of social solidarity and deviance. He came to see crime as natural and bound up with the fundamental conditions of all social life. Society abstracted into normal and malignant realms, he claimed, reflecting the ideas of degeneration. Degenerescence in its different forms constitutes an entity suitable for psychological terrain for the causes which make a man decide to kill himself. Admittedly, the degenerate kills himself more easily than the healthy subject, he wrote. This brings us to the work of Cesare Lombroso. I introduced Lombroso a bit during my last talk for those of you who were there, but Lombroso began working with mental patients at hospitals throughout Italy. In 1880, he co-founded the Journal of Psychiatry, Criminal Anthropology, and the Science of Penology. He was worried about the threat of uncivilized, atavistic peasants immigrating to the growing urban areas with Italy's unification. In 1871, he published White Men and Black Men, Lecture on the Origin and Variety of the Human Race. And he helped found the International Congress on Criminal Anthropology that took place between 1885 and 1911. In 1897, he published Delinquent Man, which was, his major opus. And it's because of the work of Lombroso that the field of criminology takes off. And it is still with us today. We still enjoy his legacy. In his text, Criminal Man, he wrote that this was not merely an idea, but a revelation. And he's talking about his discovery, so-called discovery, in terms of focus on the shape of the skull as an indicator to internal pathology that would lead toward criminality. Said, at the sight of that skull, I seemed to see all of a sudden, lighted up as a vast plain under a flaming sky, the problem of the nature of the criminal, an atavistic being who reproduces in his person the ferocious instincts of primitive humanity and the inferior animals. Thus were explained anatomically the enormous jaws, high cheekbones, prominent superciliary arches, extreme size of the orbits, handle-shaped ears found in criminals, savages, and apes, insensibility to pain, extremely acute sight, tattooing, excessive idleness, love of orgies, and the irresponsible craving of evil for its own sake. The desire not only to extinguish life in the victim, but to mutilate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood. He also wrote that the born criminal has projecting ears, thick hair, and a thin beard, projecting frontal eminences, large jaws, a square projecting chin, high cheekbones, and frequent gesticulation. It is, in short, a type resembling the Mongolian or sometimes the Negroid. So criminal anthropology, as it is born with these ideas in mind. Its emergence in the 19th century, like its sibling anthropology, should be understood as an intellectual discourse within the broader contextual history of European imperialism and colonial expansion. As such, it assumed a certain hegemonic task to provide the ideological construction of the specific pathologies defining human quote unquote others. And this is what I refer to as the birth of Homo criminalis. As my good friend and sometimes collaborator, Jason Ambrose, wrote, these practitioners projected the existence of a class of offenders against the law that further existed as a unique and differential category of mankind. As a result of this projection, the criminal was invented as an object in the field of knowledge. Here, this is a drawing from a further work in search of a scientific physiognomy of the criminal. And the main point to take away from this is that the biologization of criminality accomplishes two tasks. First, it provides a narrative explanation for quote, so-called incurable cases that preserves the positivist conceptions of the discipline, right? And it also provides a space to reconceptualize previous societal prejudices as not prejudices at all, but rational responses to natural, biologically determined phenomena. And that's very important. So to shift gears and go back and look at what the late 19th century impact was in terms of the prison boom in the US. I quote here from A. Phillips, who was the future governor of the Mississippi Penitentiary, who said in 1865 that emancipating the Negroes will require a system of penitentiaries. The one in Jackson was nearly full when the courts had but little to do with Negroes. But how will it be now? And what he's referring to there is that up until the Civil War in most of the US, if Black people were going to be punished, they were punished either by the whip or by hanging. The prisons that were built largely weren't meant for them, particularly in the South. So the prisons that were built in the South, they were almost exclusively white until the Civil War. I remind us also the 13th Amendment by now, hopefully surprise to no one, right, that it does not abolish slavery, only adjust the terms in which slavery is justifiable, and that adjustment being that as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, right? So post-emancipation prisons in the US, Southern states saw a vast expansion of vagrancy laws with penalties set as years of prison labor. Police, DAs, and judges arrested, prosecuted, and heavily sentenced mostly Blacks accused of minor theft while largely ignoring white malefactors. Property crime prosecution of Black folks, spurred by widespread destitution, suddenly superseded violent crime convictions of whites. And thousands of Blacks served long sentences on chain gangs for petty theft and misdemeanors in the late 1860s and 1870s. And thousands more went to the convict lease system. Southern prison systems remain during this period between 45% and 65% Black. Here we can see, we have a brief rundown of the expansion of both the convict lease system and the beginning of building more prisons in the South. Louisiana started us off, as they also started us off with policing, with their convict lease system that started before the Civil War, actually, because they already had a jail in New Orleans where captured runaway slaves were being put to work as, the first city public works department. But it was greatly expanded in 1865. And then you have an Angola Penitentiary that was built in 1880, which remains to this day the largest prison in the United States. Mississippi started their convict lease system in 1865, Tennessee, 1866, South Carolina, 1867, both started their convict lease system and built a new penitentiary. Georgia started their convict lease system in 1868 and on down. I have a star here by Texas because we're going to talk more about Texas in a second. But Texas is a special case. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But briefly, the convict lease system, folks were used to build roads for cities. They were used to build railroads. They were used to build bridges. Of course, farming, mining. Women were used as well. And these were the cages that they were transported in. These were horse-drawn, mobile prison units that could hold about 30 folks all together. And this is the Georgia State Farm Prison, what it looked like in 1819, with folks out there picking cotton. It's important to realize that without the convict lease system, the destruction that the South saw after the Civil War would have never been repaired. It was only due to the shifting manner of slavery that the South was able to repair the damage that it suffered as a result of the Civil War. Douglas Blackman, in his book, Slavery by Another Name, which has also been made into a documentary that's on PBS, you can search it out, said that by 1900, the South's judicial system had been wholly reconfigured to make one of its primary purposes the coercion of African Americans to comply with the social customs and labor demands of whites. W.E.B. Du Bois also commented on the system in Black Reconstruction in America, where he wrote that the whole criminal system came to be used as a method of keeping Negroes at work and intimidating them. Above all, crime was used in the South as a source of income for the state. And David Oshinsky, in his book, Worse Than Slavery, which is the predecessor to his Pulitzer Prize winning book on polio, he wrote that the death rate among convicts in Mississippi during the 1880s ranged from 9 to 16% annually. Not a single leased convict ever lived long enough to serve a sentence of 10 years or more. The hallmark of the new discipline of criminal anthropology, like all the new sciences of man that emerged in the 19th century, was positivism and progressivism, i.e. that with scientific understanding comes the possibility of cure and prevention, not simply the palliation of symptoms. Not only the prevention of disease, but the prevention of madness, as well as the prevention of deviance. But if the criminal was incurable as an individual, that merely implied that the level of intervention would need to shift. And so we get three branches, or sort of three different approaches to crime and homo criminalis that emerge out of this period. One is prolonged isolation, which is long-term incarceration or institutionalization, suppression with surveillance and control through intensified policing, or in the most extreme cases, extermination. And there was a likewise crisis of faith with the asylum system. That's a whole different history that I don't have time to get into, but also that same enthusiasm that we were going to be able to cure people who had really, really severe mental health disorders also waned during this time as well. So I want to get us to the post-civil rights movement prison boom. The prison building industry was one of the largest in America in the decades after the civil rights movement. It was boosted by tough on crime policies, mandatory minimum sentencing, and most notably, the war on drugs. The convict lease system, which had been outlawed almost everywhere in the United States by World War II, was replaced by prison-owned industries. So the states no longer leased their prisoners out to private companies. Instead, the prisons had their own industries in-house. So it didn't change the working conditions much of how prisoners were used. It just changed in terms of who they did the work for. The dismantling of the legal racial caste system spurred innovations in the technologies of oppression. And that's the most important point I really want to make. Where Black skin on its own was no longer evidence of biological degeneracy, but criminality was. Here, I want to point us to where we can see we can take a longitudinal look at the prison and jail population of the United States. The United States doesn't start keeping national records until 1926. So we don't know how many people were held before then. But I want to point out here that you see that the number of people incarcerated in the US up until roughly the 1970s remained relatively steady at around 200,000 individuals. It is only during the post-civil rights era that we begin to see this exponential rise. Whereby in the 2000s, the total number of people in prison and jail combined reaches the level of 3 million people. And nearly half of those people remained African American. In the American South, that was always the case, that at least half of the prisoners were African American. But in northern states and in western states, this wasn't always the case. Blacks were usually overrepresented by about half. So if their percent population was 12% of overall US population, they maintained about 24% in the prisons. But it's only in the aftermath of the civil rights movement that we see this rate of incarceration go up across the board for African Americans and for Latinos during this period. Also a note about the Latino population before the 1980s, most states classified Latinx Americans as white. And so we don't have disaggregated data for them. So it doesn't show there. But I want to bring us back to our special case of Texas. It is the leading incarcerator in the United States. And just to point out how this exponential growth took place, before 1972, Texas had only 18 prisons. All but one were former plantations that had been converted into prison farms. But today, Texas has 73 state prisons, along with 17 state jails and 12 private prisons, which is nearly 100 institutions, right? So it goes in only a short period of time. It went from 18 to over 100, and an unknown number of ICE prisons. This is something that, really needs to be further, talked about, and I don't have time for it here, but there are some known incarceration centers for undocumented migrants, and there are a lot of secret Black sites too. And we don't know the exact number of those secret Black sites. But it is a huge cause for concern as the prison industry has begun to shift their business model to look at undocumented migrants as a population that can continue their growth as the US begins to realize that the percentage of Americans incarcerated is untenable and unacceptable. So, in conclusion, crime and justice in America. We have seen where a number of the laws were written in various jurisdictions to specifically criminalize Black Americans, where policing was designated to target many Black communities, and that is a holdover from my last talk, where disparate sentencing has been discriminatory toward Black Americans, and where prisons were designed to enslave Black Americans for profit. And that has brought us to the current state of mass incarceration as it now stands. And this has been a brief overview, but I leave you just with the idea that to end mass incarceration, we really have to rethink our criminal justice system on every level. And that means the way that laws have been written, the way that policing has been organized, and the way that sentencing is managed and handed out. And also the way prisons are designed, now being more and more designed for profit reasons. Even state-run prisons, you know, sometimes still have their factories that have leasing arrangements with private companies. Prisoners do not qualify to make minimum wage. They are usually paid somewhere between 25 cents and $1 per hour for their labor. And these practices continue. So with that, I think we are just at 12:46.
We have a few minutes, yes.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes. I'm sorry I had to speed through that.
That's okay.
Yeah, but so we have a couple minutes for questions.
We have a couple in the chat box. And before I dive into those, Dr. Glenn, can you talk about what you might present going forward in terms of this topic or the future topics that you might cover?
I think the mental health angle, you know, the history of the asylums is probably the next logical step. They mirror this history somewhat. And the deinstitutionalization movement that took place in the 1960s, which was supposed to be replaced by community mental health centers that largely didn't materialize, has been very much responsible for a lot of the homelessness in America. And that, you know, overlaps with a lot of the criminalization of poverty. So I think that would be a good logical next step to talk about some of the similarities and differences that we have in the history of mental health treatment and in the history of asylums.
It's very interesting. I think that would be great to cover. One of our individuals today on the community conversation asked, she apologized if this was covered before, but she wanted to know if US prisons have always been for profit, if they were always run by for-profit companies.
So no, that's been a relatively, you know, so the prisons were designed with the idea that prisoners would work. But there was huge contention as prison industries began to sell products and, you know, make, or not just make money, but displace free workers. And this was a huge issue, particularly in northern states. In the southern states, they put prisoners to work in the industries that free labor really didn't want to be bothered with in order to avoid that conflict. But in the North, there was actually legislation that got passed at the federal level that limited, you know, or and greatly regulated prison labor such that it couldn't overly impact free labor. As far as the for-profit side of it goes, that's been a largely the post-civil rights era in terms of the private prisons. That has been a more contemporary phenomena, along with the sort of neoliberalization of law enforcement in general. So this overlaps with things like your asset forfeiture laws, which were passed as part of the war on drugs in the 1980s, and allow for law enforcement organizations to confiscate property and cash if you are suspected of being a drug dealer, or of having drugs on your person. And the difference, I emphasize suspected there because you don't have to be convicted in order for those confiscations to take place. Mm-hmm. And that has amounted to over a $500 million a year for-profit incentive for law enforcement organizations at both the federal and the local levels.
Well, there are a lot of comments in the chat box thanking you for your presentation today and commenting how informative it has been. And one last question that is come up in different ways is people want to know how to get involved. And I'm wondering if that's something maybe you could just touch on real quickly, but that maybe you could give us something that we can share out through email to all of the participants as well, Dr. Glenn.
Sure. First and foremost, and I talked about this a little bit during my last presentation, right, is to, when we think about reform in our criminal justice system, we need to be thinking about not asking law enforcement agencies to solve structural problems in terms of inequality and untreated mental health issues, right? First and foremost. So a huge way toward that is educating ourselves on the percent of persons who end up in our criminal justice system because of untreated mental health issues, untreated substance abuse problems, and the way that we have criminalized poverty in the United States. And the way that, their different localities have begun to profit off of those policies, right? And we have to stand up and say, not in our name. So we need to push for, more progressive policies in that area, which is sort of the brief synopsis, but I could get more, detailed over email if folks want to email me, and you can feel free to do so.
And we might even be able to devote a whole community conversation at the end of your series to how do we get involved? Mm-hmm. I don't know, and then we could invite a few other people to join in the conversation as well. So we can look at that. That would be great. Awesome. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Sorry we have to cut. I know there could be lots more comments. Sorry we have to cut you off today, but we really appreciate your being